morning, everybody. I'm really sorry that I'm a little bit late. Actually, very late.
Wait a moment. Sorry. Okay. Go.
All right. I guess we are finally live. I'm really sorry that I'm very late. I had some difficulties with Microsoft Teams, but I'm happy that I'm here finally. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen, and if that is correct, let's get started. So today I'll be taking you on a workshop of building a game with JavaScript. I know that for most people who saw the agenda, all my session said was just, let's build a game. So you might be wondering, what game are we building? What exactly is happening? So as developers, when we work for a long time, it's always necessary to take a break, play a game, stuff like that. So I thought building a game would be a fun thing to do. And a quick disclaimer, I have built this game before, so it's not entirely something new. So here's how we're going to get started. I have the folder we'll be using open here already. And the only thing I have here is a folder that contains different sounds. So the game is called Simon Game. I'd like to show a demo of how the game works just before we start building it. If I can do that. Okay. So the Simon Game basically says that you are playing against the computer, right? And the computer there are a number of buttons, about 4 of them. So for each level of the game, patterns are created. The computer generates different buttons, and you have to remember the exact sequence in which the buttons are generated by the computer for you to move to the next stage. So I want to show you a quick demo of how that works, then we'll get into building it straight away. So here in the sounds folder, I have 5 sounds. We have one sound for the blue button, another sound for the green, one for the red, and one for the yellow. Then finally, there's a sound that is going to go on if your sequence is wrong, if you choose a wrong button while you're trying to, get the sequence that the computer put out there. So I think my Google Chrome is open now, so I can quickly show you the demo of the game. So here's what the game looks like. You can press any key on your keyboard to start. So say I press A, the computer just chose the yellow button, and if I click on that, then that's right, I move to the next level. If you were quick enough, you'd see that the computer has chosen the red button as the next in the sequence. So now I have to go yellow, red. That's right, now I'm in level 3. And now the sequence is yellow, red, blue. So you keep on doing this until you lose. So if I go yellow, red, green, so it tells me that the game is over and I can press any key to restart the game all over again. So that's basically how the game is going to work. So let's get started. So first and foremost, of course, we need to have our HTML file, because that is what we'll be using as the structure. So I'm just going to create a file called game.html and use the default so in all of our buttons, and above the container, I'm just going to have a H1 that says press any key to start the game, the heading. And for me to select this in my Java, it's an ID, and I'm going to call it level title, like this. So in the container, I'm going to have 2 rows. Each row will hold 2 buttons each. So a class row, 2 classes of row. And then going to have 2 divs. Each div will have a class of button. The type is also going to be going to have this yellow. These will have a class of red. And then let's just duplicate this and paste these 2 buttons in the other row. Okay, so now this will be green, blue. I guess that is all. Also, each of these will also have an ID which we'll use to select. ID is yellow. The ID of this red. This is everything we need for the structure. This is basically the body and a container. The container holds 2 rows and each of the rows holds 2 buttons. So if we open this in our live server, let's just see what the structure is looking like right now. And you can do this by opening up live server. So this is all we have on the screen now, nothing crazy. So let's move on. So now let's create some very basic style, at least to make it look a lot like where we are going. I hope you are still with me. Made a mistake. This shouldn't be here. Game.html shouldn't be inside sounds. All about the HTML structure. So let's add some very simple styling to make it look a lot better. Okay, so I'm going to create another file here, call it game.css. So let's just go with some very quick styling. Now for the entire body, I'm just going to align everything to the center, as you can see here. So I have to open this up again. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to align everything to the center like we have over here. So we'll do that in the body tag. Align to the center. And then we're going to give the body this background color, make it look a lot better. Hash 011 F3. Oh, I forgot to link. Coding can be crazy sometimes. I need to use the link tag. So it's just game.css. Okay. So now I have added a background color to the entire body. The next thing we have to do now is to move over to the H1. And remember that I gave it an ID of level title. So we just use that ID to select level title. We are going to give that a font size, a big font size, so that it's readable. Font size will be 5 rem, and the color would be #FEF 2BF. Okay, it's starting to look lots better. Now, for each of these classes, we are just for each of the buttons, because as you can see here, each of the buttons has a class of button, and we use that to make it look like a button using border radius and all of that. So I'm just going to use the .btn CSS selector and give the following styles. I'm going to give each of them a width and a height of 20 pixels, 200 pixels. Border of white, so that it will contrast well on the background color. Then the border radius. And finally, let's just give it some margin. Okay, so we have that here. Each of the buttons now has a border radius. Let's talk about the container. Block, a width of 50%, and center everything. I'm asking the computer to give the same margins on the left and on the right, on the top and on the bottom. So what that does is to try to perfectly center the entire div at the middle of the page. So to get the colors, I'm just going to choose the individual classes. For yellow, I'm just going to have a background color of yellow. I can copy that and change it for each. So for red, background color will be red. Blue will be blue. And for green, it will be green. Okay, let's see how that looks now. Okay, so everything's, they can't see the game. Oh, sorry. That means I'm sharing just one tab. I'm so sorry. How can I share? Okay, so can you see the browser? Oh, they only see the Visual Studio Code. Okay. How can I share multiple tabs then? Okay, can you all see my the game now from the browser? Can we all see the browser now? Okay, so I'm back here. So for each of the buttons, I just give them the color that corresponds to it. Now I'm going to create 2 extra classes. You will see when we use them. One, when the game is over, that means when you choose a wrong sequence compared to the sequence that the computer provides for you, then the game should be over. And for that, I'm going to create a background color of red, and the opacity will be 0.75. Another color, I'll just call it pressed. This color will be applied when a particular button has been clicked. I'm going to give that a box shadow of 20 pixels and white. And the background color is going to be gray. So here is how the game is looking like currently. I hope you can also see the game now. I hope you can all see the game now. Okay, I'm hoping that means a yes. So let's just get on with the functionality. Now I'm going to have to create a JavaScript file because that is what is going to handle the functionality. What exactly happens when a button is clicked and all of that. So in here, I'm just going to create a new file and I'm going to call it game.js. Here is where all of the good stuff is going to happen. So if you go back to the game, let's try to make sense of exactly what is happening here. This is the game that is working. So at the beginning, before I press any key, I'm unable to start the game. By the way, this game only works on desktop for now, so we just have to make do with that. So for me to start the game at all, I need to press a key, and a key here refers to any key on my computer, any keyboard key. I can press, whether that be A, B, enter, whatever. Any key can start the game. Now, when the game is started, say I click on letter A, the first thing that happens is the computer by default chooses a random button. I didn't even see what the computer chose. Let's just start again. So the computer chooses this button yellow. That's the first thing that happens. And now I have to click on the button yellow for me to move. So that means that the computer is choosing one out of the 4 buttons available. So all the available buttons so that we can track which of them. So here in my game.js, I'm just going to create an array to store the button colors. So I'll call it button colors, and it's going to be an array with each of the colors as a string. So I have green, yellow, red, and blue. Those are the button colors. Now, how are we going to store the pattern that the computer is choosing the colors? Because if the computer chooses the first color as yellow and the next one as red, the next one as blue, then the pattern has become yellow, red, blue. unless I, as the user, the person who is playing the game, also chooses that exact same pattern, I'm going to lose. So that means that we need to find a way to also track the patterns that the computer chooses. So I'm just going to create another array. I'll call it game pattern, and that is where I'll be storing the corresponding patterns that the corresponding button colors that the computer chooses as the pattern. For now, it's an empty array because I haven't done anything with it just yet. So let's just have that there. Now I'm going to have another array, and I'm going to call it user clicked pattern. The job of this array is to store the buttons that I, as the person who is playing, chooses, so that at the end of the day I can compare my own pattern with the computer pattern or the game pattern, and if a match is found, that means that I have won that level and I can move on to the next level. This also will be an empty array starting out. Then of course, since we want to check that a key is pressed before we start the game, we need to have a way of checking whether or not the game has been started. So let's just call that game started, and by default it should be false, because of course you can only start a game that hasn't been started yet. Then lastly, we are going to have something to track the level that the player is in, and the starting level is 0, of course. So these are 5 are the variables that we are going to get started with. I'm hoping that you can still hear me. I'm hoping that you can still hear me. So of course, just before we go on, we need to link, because the HTML file at this point has no idea where the JavaScript file is. So let's just create 2 script tags, one for jQuery and one for our JS scripts. 1 minute, please. So let's tell, of course, it is just inside that file called game.js, and it already has access to that. So I'm just going to click game.js, and that works. Lastly, for this particular game, I'll be using jQuery. A lot of controversies have gone on about whether jQuery is still a technology to be learned at this day and age. And I don't know, everybody has different opinions, but we're going to use it for this game anyway. So I'm just going to link to the jQuery CDN like this. CDN simply online, right? So you can always link to it without having to download the entire code base that is called jQuery to your system, because it's a lot. So I'm just going to use this CDN. CDNs are freely available online if you check. Okay, so this is the script. So just to confirm that the script is working, I'll just print out an alert on the screen. If this works, if the game.js and the jQuery are working well, then an alert saying the script works should be printed to the screen. So let's check that out. And yes, it works. So it says the script works. So we are good to go. Now let's get started with the actual logic, because development, of course, includes or involves a lot of logic. So now that we have these 5 variables to get started with, next thing will be to determine how exactly do we start the game. Like we have said, we want a key press. We want the user to be able to click any key on his device, and that should start up the game. I'm supposed to be able to share the entire monitor. I don't know why I'm unable to do that. It's not allowing me to share the desktop. So now that we have this the 5 variables that we need, at least at this point, we are going to have to code up the logic of the game does not start unless a key has been pressed. We are using jQuery, and of course, well, I want to believe that you know that when you use jQuery, we use the $ to select DOM elements from our HTML. So in this case, the entire web page where the entire game is known as the document element. So we can select the document element like so. So I'm selecting the document element, and I will call the key press listener, event listener. It's an event listener. It listens for key presses. And the way it works is it takes a callback function. Every time a key is pressed, whatever is inside the callback function is what will be executed. So now I'm just going to call the function like so. And there are 2 things I want to check. I want to check if the game has not already started, because if the game has already started, then there's nothing to start. We just move to the next stage. But if the game has not been started yet, then we want to start the game. So I do that by using the if to check. So I say if the game not started is true. If the game has not been started, and that means game started is true, right? The value of game started is correct. In this case, it's false. So if that is that, then we can now start the game. And to start the game, I have to change the content of the H1. Initially, the H1 says press any key to start the game. But now that the game wants to start, I have to change that to say the current level. So I'll also use my $ to choose the H1. So in this case, I write something like this because the H1 has an ID. So I can just select any element that has an ID of level title. And then I can change the text property of that to say level plus the actual value of level, the actual value of game level. And at this point, game level is still 0. We are still on level 0. So nothing crazy is going to happen. Right? Let's just check what our game looks like now. So here's what the game looks like now. If I click on any key, it just says level 0. Nothing more is going to happen because that's where our logic stands at right now. So let's go back to our code. Now, what happens after? I know I'm supposed to be able to share my entire window, but for some reason I'm not able to. So I just have to keep switching between Visual Studio and the browser. So after I've been able to write the level that the gamer is on now, which is level 0, what is the next thing I want to do? The next thing I want to do is to start the sequence, is to make the computer generate a sequence. So that is going to come in another different function, and I'm just going to call the function here game sequence. So this game sequence is what generates the sequence, the different types of buttons that the computer generates for us to play with. So I'm just going to call it game sequence. We're going to write this function in just 1 minute. And then because the game is now started, the value of game started will now change from false to true. All right, so this is the first thing. So just a quick recap. I have to select the entire document, which is the web page where the entire game is. And then I would call an event listener. In this case, what I want the web page to listen for is for any key press. So listen if any key on the keyboard is pressed, and if that happens, then run this function. Within this function, ensure that the game has not been started yet. Ensure that the game has not been started. And if that is true, then you can change the text of the H1 from saying press any key to start the game to now say level plus the game level. So say something like level 0 or level 1. Actually level 0, because at this stage the level is still 0. After that, let the computer generate a sequence for the game, then change the value of game started to true. Now let's see how the computer is going to generate the sequence for the game. So let me just try here sequence generation so that you can follow along. So how does the computer generate the sequence? Now let's go back to explain what a sequence is. I mean, the computer just says, okay, just gives an alert by using the kind of like a flashing method to say, okay, this is the button, the first button I'm giving you. What can you do with this? So basically, the computer is able to do this by selecting out of these 4 button colors we have. It selects a random button. And how can it select a random button? Okay, let's just create the function here. The function is called game sequence. Now remember that our game pattern here is an empty array. Nothing is happening in there. Now, when the game sequence function is called, it should move to the next level, right? Because the default level is level 0. Now you want to move to level 1. When you get to level 1, you now test whether the sequence you have chosen as the player is equal to the sequence that the computer has chosen. And if that is true, you can move to the next level. So the first thing I'm going to do is to increment value of game level by 1. I'll just use this increment operator. That's the first thing we have to do. And once we do this, we have to change the text inside that H1 to now read the value of the new level. So I'll do it just like I did here. Hash level title. And the text property of that. The text property of that is now going to read level plus current level. So this will now read level 1 instead of level 0. Now I need to be able to choose a random button out of this 4. And we can choose random buttons by using the math.random function. So I'm just going to say math.random. I'll call that function, and this gives you random numbers from 0 to 9. It's actually in floating point, and to make it into a whole number, I'll just multiply this by the number of elements from within which range I want the random numbers to go from. So I'm going to multiply this by 4, which is the number of buttons. So math.random times 4, and that will still give us a floating point number. So I can wrap the whole thing in the math.floor method. That reduces it to the closest whole number. So floor, the value you get from math.random multiplied by 4. And to make this easy, I'll just store it into another variable, and we'll call the variable random number. So every time that this function is called, a new random number between 0 to 4 is generated. Actually, between 0 to 3 is generated. So that would mean between red, yellow, between green, yellow, red, and blue, a random number will be generated. But I don't really need the random number. What I want to use the random number for is to get a random button. So now I'm going to use that random number. And if you remember, when we were using arrays, we use this method to get elements from the array. The array name, in this case, is button colors. Then we use a square bracket like this, followed by the index of the button we want to get. So in this case, the index is just going to be random number. So this means that at any point, the color that you get, if random number, if the first random number is 0, choose the yellow button, 2 will choose the red, and 3. And to make this easy to read, let's also store this value into another variable. So I'll call this random chosen color. Random chosen color. So that's the button color that is randomly chosen by the computer. Now, every time that the computer randomly chooses this color, what we want is for that color that has been in the game, because the game pattern is going to store the different button colors that the user chooses, that the computer chooses. So now we have to use the push method to do just that. So I'm going to call the game pattern push. Now, what am I pushing into the game pattern array? I'm going to push the randomly chosen color. The randomly chosen color, that's what I'm going to push. Now, to show you how will the user be able to know that, okay, the color that the computer chose by default, by random, is blue. So the sequence I have to choose is blue. I'm going to implement this just using fade in, fade out to do a quick kind of transition. So let me show you how it works here in the actual game that has been completed. So this is the completed game. Let's try to play this. If I click on any key to start, animation to show that the color the computer generated is yellow. So if I click on it now, I can move to the next. So that quick animation is what I want to show you now. I'll be using fade in and fade out to simulate this quick animation. So let's do that quickly. So what I'm going to do now is to, of course, use the dollar to select the element or the button, which will be hash plus that randomly chosen color. So if the randomly chosen color here is green, hash green will choose the button. Remember, that's why we add up the buttons. You have hash red, hash yellow. Oh, I made a mistake here. Hash red, hash yellow, hash blue, and hash red. So this will choose whatever element with that corresponding ID. So hash plus the randomly chosen color. Then I'll use these methods. Fade in 0.1 milliseconds, fade out 0.1 milliseconds, then fade back in for 0.1 milliseconds. This is simply to make it obvious that this is the color that was randomly generated. Then lastly, you listen to that sound that played now. So we are going to have to play the sound of that randomly chosen color. So I'll use a method called play sound, and to play the sound, because each of the colors, each of the button colors has a sound assigned to it, like you can see. There's a sound.mp3 for when the blue is chosen, when the green is chosen, the red and the yellow. Now this place sound is an entirely different from it's usable here, and quickly write function play sound. So that's what we are going to do now. We are just going to create the play sound function, and all that the play sound function is going to do is to create an instance of the audio object. This will allow us to call the play method on that audio object. So I'll write it like this. I'll create a new instance by using the new keyword, new audio. Then I have to tell it where to find that particular audio. I can do that using concatenation. So I'll tell it to look into a sounds folder, which is what we have here. We have the sounds folder Okay, so I'm back. I'm really sorry. I had electricity issues. So let me just so we were here. So now we are trying to create the play sound function. So all we have to do is to tell the computer where to get the sounds that correspond to the particular button that has been clicked. So I create a new instance of the audio by using the new keyword, and then I tell it to look inside the sounds folder. Look inside the sounds folder, then search for a name, which I'm going to pass in as the parameter here. So I'm just going to use name as the parameter. So it means that every time I try to run the play sound function, I have to give it the color, right? The button color, and that will determine if it's going to play. That will determine if it's going to play blue, green, red, wrong, or yellow, right? So here I'm just going to use name as a parameter. So I would say create a new instance of audio and use it to open this file. Look inside the sounds folder, right? Then the name that corresponds to the name I gave as the parameter, then that has an extension of .mp3. Just use single quotes since that's what I've been using since. Right, so when it has gotten that name, I can now call the play method that the audio object has, and that will play our audio like so. Okay, don't know where this, okay. Okay, so that is now going to play the audio. So since I've created that function here, after the whole process that the computer goes through to create the sequence for the pattern generated by the computer, then it's going to play the sound that corresponds to the chosen color. So let's try to open up our game again to see what we have now. Try and open with live server to see what we have right now. Okay, port 5500. Let's wait for that to open up. So while that is opening up, we are basically done with the game sequence. I'm basically done with the game sequence function. But next question is, okay, so we now know the computer now knows how to generate a default, how to choose a random color, and for each random color that the computer chooses, it pushes it into the game pattern array. So the random color, the order in which they exist in the game pattern array is how it's going to check, right, compared to our own pattern, and if there's a match, then the game is going to move to the next level. Now that that's done, the next thing we need to figure out is what should happen when we, as the user, clicks on a button, because clicking on a button is how we make our own sequence. It's how we choose our own buttons, and for each button that we click as the user, that is what is going to go into our own game pattern array, and that will be used to determine whether we win or we lose that game. So now let's see what is going to happen when we do that. So what we are in essence saying is, what should happen when I click on a button? What should happen when we click on a button? So let me open this first just to see let's just see what we have so far. I think I can. So this is what we have so far, and if I click on a button, it starts level 0 again. Oh, why? Okay. I see why that happened. Okay. Okay, now it plays the sound. Okay, let me close this here. Fade it out. All right, so now we have to determine what happens when the button is clicked. Let me just come here and define a function for that. So basically, I can use my jQuery once more. Instead of selecting the entire document, what I want to do in this case is to select every button. I remember that we created a class called BTN here, and that BTN corresponds to each of the 4 buttons. So we can just use that single BTN class to select all the buttons. So I do this, select every element that has a class of BTN like this. And when you have selected that, listen for a click event. In the other time, we're listening for a key press event, but this time around, you want to listen for a click event. Let me share my screen. Okay. The other time we're listening for a key press event, but now we want to listen for a click event. The click event, just like the key press event, also takes a callback function. So within the callback function is where we define what we want or how we want we as the user to create our own patterns. Now, the case of the user is very different from the case of the computer, because in this case, for each button that we click, we know the ID that corresponds to that button. So we need to be able to get that ID attribute and store it inside a particular variable. Now, jQuery allows us to get the attribute of ID like so. We search for the currently clicked button, which we can get using the keyword this. Then we look for the ID attribute of that button like this, and then we store the value inside, let's say, a variable we call user chosen color. Every time that we click a button, we know what ID corresponds to that button. So we can use the attribute of ID, we can get the ID attribute from that particular button, and then we save that color, because the ID in this case refers to yellow, red, green, or blue. So we save that ID inside this variable we call user chosen color. And now we can push the user chosen color to our user clicked pattern, which is what we hold the patterns of the colors that we click on as user. So I'll say user clicked pattern dot push user chosen color. Chosen color. Okay. So after we push the particular color that corresponds to the ID of the button that the user clicks, then we have to play the sound associated with that color, associated with that button color. We've already defined the play sound method down below, so we just have to provide a parameter. And in this case, what sound do we want to play? We want to play the sound of the user chosen color. That is the sound that corresponds to the ID of the button the user chooses. So play sound of user chosen color. Now, after playing the sound, we want to animate the same way that there was a quick animation to show that, okay, this is the button that the computer has given us to choose. We also want to be able to add an animation to show that this is the button that the user clicked on. So I'm going to create another function that I'll call animate press, and it's also going to take in the user chosen color. We haven't defined that function yet. I'll define it in just 1 minute. Let's go down here and define the animate press function. Okay, let's see here. How do we intend to animate the press? Remember that here in our CSS, I added this default class. I said we'll use it later, that I call pressed. It gives the button a box shadow and changes the background color to gray. So this is where we are going to use it. So how do we animate the press now? Function animate press. It's taking the current color that corresponds to the ID of the button that we want to animate, and then what it's going to do is select the elements with that ID, then to that element add that class of pressed. Class of pressed. This here so we can see. Pressed like so. Add the class of pressed. Then after 0.1 milliseconds, remove that class, because we just want it to quickly show that this is the class that this is the button that has been clicked on by the user. So after 0.1 milliseconds, we want to remove that class, and we can do this using the set timeout function. So it takes a callback function, and within the callback function, I can specify what I want to happen and the time duration. So after 0.1 milliseconds, I want this to happen. I want that element that has the ID of the current color. Instead of adding the class now, I want to remove that class from it. So let's go back to what happens when we click on the button. So a quick recap. Once the user clicks on any key on their keyboard, then the game starts, and then H1 is now set to read level plus the current game level, which is 0. And after that, the function that helps the computer to create a sequence is called game sequence. And in that game sequence function, what happens is that the game level is increased, the text of the H1 is updated to reflect the new level, then a random number is used to get a random button from the button's color array, and that randomly chosen button is pushed into the game pattern, and then a quick animation is done to show which particular button was chosen. That is what happens when the key press, or when any key is pressed to start the game. Now, what happens when we as the user actually wants to play the game? What happens when we click on a particular button? In this case, because each of the buttons has a particular ID that identifies it, when we click on the button, we can get that ID attribute from that button and save it into this variable called user chosen color. Previously, we had created an empty array called user clicked pattern. We can now push in this user chosen color for every single time that a button is clicked. Then the user chosen color is added to the user clicked pattern, and then we play the sound that corresponds to that chosen color, and then we animate the press. But after doing all of this, what is the next thing? It's now time to check the sequence that we have as the user, which is the user clicked pattern, and the sequence that the computer has, which is the game pattern. Are they equal? And if they are equal, then the game can move to the next stage. If they are not equal, the game ends and you lose and you have to start all over again. So how can we do that? We can use another function in this case to determine what will happen if our sequence as the user is correct or it is wrong. So just after the user chosen color is animated, we now want to check for the answer. So I'll just create a function called check answer, and it's going to take in the level that the user is in. The level is what will help us determine if the user will move to the next level or the game will be lost in entirety. So here, this is how we're going to generate the level. We are just going to say the user clicked pattern dot length minus 1. Because remember that with arrays, the way that the length property works is just that it counts the number of items in the array. So button colors dot length here will be 4 because there are 4 items in the array. But actually the index stops at 3 because the index of this first button is 0, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. And the index of the last item, right, at each level is what we need. That is why we have to put the -1 here. Now let's go and specify the check answer function. Let's just do it here. This function is going to check, compare the user clicked pattern, our own pattern, with the game pattern to see if there's a match. So the function to check answer works like this. It takes in the level as its param. We need that. So it takes in the level, and then it does 2 checks. There are 2 things we need to check before we can actually see if there's a comparison. One, we need to check if both the level for the game pattern is the same, right? Is the same or is equal to the level for the user click pattern. We also have to check if the number of elements or the length, the number of elements inside our own pattern as the user is the same as number of elements inside the pattern that the game creates. So we have to run those 2 checks. Let's do that quickly. If game pattern level equal to user clicked pattern level, if that is true, we also have to run this second check. If the user clicked pattern, if the length of that is equal to the length of the game pattern, if that's equal to the length of the game pattern, that means that there's no problem. We are still on the same, right? The scores are still going on well. You've not made any mistake. The sequences are still equal. So of course, if the sequences are still equal, what you need to do is to generate a new sequence again. So it runs the game sequence function all over again. But now it will run the game sequence function every 1 millisecond. So it's going to give 1 millisecond for, it's going to give a 1 millisecond gap every time that these 2 checks are true. So we use the set timeout function once more, and we say for every 1 millisecond, which is what we have when we put 1000 here, for every 1 millisecond where these 2 both checks are true, then run the game sequence again. And what it does again is to, the same way we had in the game sequence, it chooses another random number, chooses another random color, adds it to the game pattern, and checks one more time. So it keeps on doing that for every level at which these 2 properties are true. But if for any reason one of these 2 properties are false, then we are going to have to run an else check. So if these 2 properties are not true, that means that we have lost the game. Our own pattern is now a mismatch with the game pattern. And what should happen in that case? In this case, we are going to play a new sound, and instead of this being one of the sounds of blue, green, yellow, or red, we're now going to play the sound of wrong to show that what you just chose is the wrong color. So wrong, play the sound of wrong, and then we are going to add, do you remember that class that I called game over here, where the background color of the body will be red and the opacity will be 0.75? So this is where we are going to add it. After I play the sound of wrong, I'm now going to pick the body. That's kind of like the document, but the body. I'm going to pick that and add a class of game over. So this means that the entire body is now going to have a background of red and an opacity of 0.75. So I add a class of game over, and then the H1 has to change, of course, because previously the H1 will be reading the current level that you are in the game, but now you have lost the game. So the H1 has to change what it reads, and it's now going to read, the text property is now going to read game over. Press any key to start, to restart. To restart. That's what the H1 is now going to read. And after that, we don't want the game over class to keep on being applied. We just want it for a brief split seconds, and should go back to what we had before. So we will use the set timeout function, set timeout, and say that after 0.2 milliseconds, 200, remove that class from the body. And then finally, we are going to call this method called start over. We haven't defined it, but we will right now. So the start over simply says, okay, so you've lost the game. Here are the things you need to do to start all over again. And what we simply have in the start over is to revert our variables from earlier, revert them all back to the default condition. So for start over, our game level has to go back to being 0, number 1. The game pattern, because of course when the game ends, there's no pattern. The game pattern has to go back to being an empty array. And finally, started, game started, has to go back to being false, like we had all along. And that's basically how the entire game works. So let me just run through it again, and then we can test the game finally. So initially we have 4 buttons: green, yellow, red, and blue. We have a game pattern, which is what will hold the pattern that the computer generates, the pattern of button colors that the computer generates. We have user clicked pattern, which is for our own as the player. The pattern of colors that we choose will be stored inside user clicked pattern. Both of them are empty arrays for a start. We need to know whether the game has started or not. By default, game started is stored as false, and the game level at the beginning is 0. The first thing we want to do is to listen, make the entire document listen for a key press. If it detects that a keyboard key has been pressed, it's going to check that the game has not started yet. Right? It's going to detect that the game has not started yet, and if that is true, it is now going to start the game. And the first thing it has to do is to change what the H1 says from press any key to start the game to now say level plus the game level. So at this point, we'll have level 0. The next thing is for it to run the game sequence function, and then game started becomes true. The game sequence function is how the computer is able to generate random buttons. So the game sequence, the game level is increased, the H1 text is changed to the current level that the user is at, then a random number is used to select from the button colors a random button color, and we store that random button color inside random chosen color. Finally, that randomly chosen button color is stored inside the game pattern array, and then we choose that randomly chosen button. We choose to show it by using the fade in, fade out, and fade back in methods, and then we play the sound that corresponds to the random chosen color. Then for when we as the player clicks on a button, we can select all of the buttons using the .btn selector, which is the class that is common to all of the buttons. And then we can get the ID attribute, which corresponds to the color red, yellow, green, and blue of the button. Save it inside user chosen color variable, and then push that button into the user clicked pattern array. Finally, we can play the sound for that user chosen color. We can animate the press to show that, okay, this is the button that we chose, and then we can check the answer to see whether the pattern we have as the player is the same as the pattern that the computer has generated. And then finally, for the check answer and the level, we have to check if both the game pattern and the user click pattern have the same level. We have to check if the length of their array is the same. Then, if it is the same, after another 1 millisecond, we can start the game sequence all over again. If any of these two checks are not correct, if any of them are wrong, then you have to play the sound of wrong to show that, oh, you've chosen a wrong sequence. And then we quickly add the class of game over, which turns the entire page to have a background of red. We update the value of the H1 to read, okay, the game is now over. Press any key to restart. And after 0.2 milliseconds, we remove that class and we start the game all over again. And the start over function returns all these variables back to the default. Game level goes back to being 0. Game pattern goes back to being an empty array. Game started goes back to being false. And for the animate press, we simply add the class of pressed, which gives a box shadow and a background color. We add that to the chosen button, and then we remove it after 0.1 milliseconds. And for the play sound, we create a new instance of the audio object, pass in the location to the sound that we want, and call the play method. So let me now share the browser so that we can test our game finally. Okay, I think it's this one. Okay, so this is the game. Hopefully nothing goes wrong. So I'm going to click my A. I have level 0. Did I see any animation done? Please watch carefully. Okay, I don't see anything animated. Let's see, there's a mistake somewhere. Am I sure my jQuery is working? I'm trying to, I don't know why having that. Okay. Okay, I think this. Game pattern of level. 1 minute, trying to figure out where. It seems like I'm having an issue with my jQuery. Okay, seems like I'm having an issue. Just so we don't take your time, I have the project link to the project in the chat so that you can check it out later at a more convenient time. And also, the deployed version of the game is here at simon-game-7.vercel.app, so you can check that when you are less busy. So this is the end of the session. Let me know if you have any questions so that I can answer them. So this is the end of the session. Let me know if you have any questions so that I can answer them now. And I'm really sorry about the network one more time. All right, there are no questions. Thank you very much. Thank you to Coach Jen. Have a nice day, everybody.